Pokemon Sword and Shield are probably the most controversial entries in the franchise, with the fanbase pretty split on a lot of creative decisions leading up to and after release of the games. I think it's pretty fair to say that they're the most divisive games in the franchise, with issues like Dexit, the removal of Mega Evolution, which is a very popular mechanic, as well as the overall scale of the game being less than what the marketing material would have led you to believe. These are all pretty good reasons for people to be upset about Sword and Shield, but 150 hours in, I've got a lot to say about it. When I first started writing the script back in 2019 when Sword and Shield came out, it was more a review, but since then, with a lot more thought and a lot more analysis, it's become more of a critique, where GameFreak went wrong, what they could do better in future with games like Pokemon Legends Arceus. Arceus, whichever way you pronounce it. I had quite a lot of issues with the marketing material before the game came out, and when the game came out, some of those were proven right, some of those proven wrong, and there were also just some entirely new issues that came up. If you're looking for any one particular part of the conversation, there are timestamps down below. Let me set the scene real fast. It's E3 2019, we know another Pokemon game is coming. Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee have left the fanbase generally unsatisfied. Lots of complaining about it being a stupid dumbed-down baby game, which Pokemon already is. That first trailer drops. Beautiful British countrysides, that classic Pokemon theme with a spunky, punky guitar riff, battle environments are looking better, Pokemon are looking sharper than ever, and then we get some of the wider views. Is that more fixed camera angles? Is that Lucario using the same focus punch animation that we've had since X and Y in 2013? Not exactly what fans wanted to be seeing in a next generation experience, so the fanbase was a little split. If you've been in the Pokemon fanbase for any amount of time, you're familiar that there are really two crowds. One, the people that will defend GameFreak no matter what and will eat up any Pokemon game. And then the other half, which is where I fall, where people feel like GameFreak are just cruising on. They're not really pushing the Pokemon franchise in any particular direction, they're just kind of on autopilot. They've been doing what's been working for the past 20 years. So now that first trailer's out, it's got a few million views, and the community is massively divided. Now, if you're watching this video, you probably know a lot of the drama anyway, but I'm gonna recap it. While the trailer itself might not have been that much of a red flag, some of the comments that the developers made in the Nintendo Treehouse event after that first trailer was shown are a lot more concerning. With this Nintendo Treehouse event, the developers officially announced that not every Pokemon is coming back. This ended up being coined Dexit, which Pokedex Brexit, for obvious reasons, and the fanbase is pretty upset. A lot of people feel like their favorite critters are getting left behind in indeterminate limbo space, which we now know is Pokemon Home. Now, at the time, they didn't say how many Pokemon were being cut. Only later, we found out that 400 Pokemon were making it into the game. Less than half of the total before Sword and Shield's release. Masuda said, through his translator, that Pokemon were being cut for the sake of quality, that the Switch enabled more expressive animation and higher quality assets, and because of that and their limited time frame to work in, they had to cut Pokemon to make ends meet. From the trailers alone, a lot of people felt like the quality argument wasn't quite fair. We're seeing the same animations that we've had for the past 6 years, back in 2019. The models don't look massively better, and later it does turn out that they're exactly the same as the 3DS models, which is not a bad thing. The 3DS models were very high poly for the system, and that's why battles in that game ran awfully, but we'll get to that later. Many fans are arguing now that the franchise has fallen to GameFreak's outdated game design, that the series has stagnated since the move to 3D with X and Y. A lot of past features that players loved, like Mega Evolutions, Pokemon following your trainer, and the GTS, or Global Trade System, for those of you that aren't familiar, are all stripped from Sword and Shield. Now, the GTS did come back in the form of Pokemon Home, which is a separate app with its own subscription. But that's a story, that's a video of its own. There are a lot of other attributes in the game that were critiqued before launch. I'm sure tons of you remember the forced experience share and the controversy around the N64 tree in the wild area. But speaking of the wild area, there are some things that people were praising the game for. Introducing that new open world area felt like a massive change to the franchise that has been linear for almost its entire time. On the flip side though, a lot of people felt like GameFreak shouldn't be praised for just updating their games to be more contemporary and less outdated. Doing the bare minimum, basically. One of the most popular additions in Generation 8 with Galar are the new Pokemon designs, like Corviknight and Dragapult, and I'm trying to remember some other ones. I'm really bad. There's so many fucking Pokemon, don't expect me to remember all the names. I'm checking the script. Dreadnought, Corviknight, and Dragapult being particular highlights. The addition of new Galarian? I don't know. Galarian forms, like the new Ponyta, were also very popular additions. If I hadn't made it clear already, I'm on the Dexit side of the fanbase. I didn't feel like the quality had improved enough to justify nuking half the Pokemon in the franchise. Many parts of the environment felt like upscaled 3DS assets. Dynamaxing just felt like a shittier discount version of Mega Evolutions, and overall, the quality of the game didn't seem like a massive step up from past titles, even though it was running on the new, more powerful Switch hardware. Despite my concerns and my initial plan to boycott the game, I decided I was going to buy it and experience it firsthand so I could critique it myself. I tried to go in as neutrally as possible, which, when you're kind of knee-deep in controversy, it's a little difficult to do. But it certainly wasn't the experience I was expecting, for better and for worse. I'm gonna be pretty blunt and direct here. I think Sword and Shield have, by far, the worst story of any Pokemon game. To properly critique it, I am gonna go through and recap all of it. To summarize, there are very few likable characters. In fact, I would say most of the characters are actively unlikable. The player has no agency in the story at all, and the gyms make the entire story. Otherwise, the plot is pretty much non-existent. What little story there is really crammed into the last 2 or 3 hours of the game. Not the greatest move for a 20 to 30 hour experience. All that being said, there are some good moments in here that I think are a nice change for the Pokemon franchise. Alright, this section's like 5,000 words, so I am going to be reading directly from the script. Normally I would drop a spoiler warning here, but realistically, if you're watching this video, you've either already played through Sword and Shield, or you don't care. So let's get on with it. I don't think many people expect a revolutionary story out of a Pokemon game. That's not what the franchise is really known for. That being said, it should still serve as a strong backbone to build the rest of the experience off of. Sword and Shield start you off like most any Pokemon game, introducing you to your rival, and obviously your goal of being the best like no one ever was, yada yada yada, you know the deal. A small twist that I appreciated is that Hop is the younger brother of Leon, the current champion. I think this gives Hop more direct motivation than a lot of rivals in the past, where it's very much just been, you and me, we're gonna go, we're rivals now, versus you and Hop having a similar goal, and Hop having, honestly, a better motivation than the player does. The game makes it pretty clear that Hop just wants to be loved and appreciated and maybe even idolized in the same way that his brother is. Leon comes down to Postwick and gifts you and Hop the choice, one of 3 starters. Scorbunny, Sobble, and Thwacky? Is that? I don't know, whatever the grass one is. He's cute, that's one I chose. I like the little drumstick monkey. In Galar, this is basically the champion's way of endorsing Mew into entering the gym challenge, which is basically the same as your normal Pokemon game, except it's more like the soccer in the UK, your national sport. It's a small, slight change from how the Pokemon Professor would give you your starter, but I think it makes more sense in this context, where it's made very clear that the gyms are a national icon in Galar. This also provides a nice character moment between Leon and Hop, where they have that sort of reaction, and Leon's motivating Hop to be like, yeah, no, you can do this. I want you to be as great as me. And Hop's like, yeah, I want to be as great as you. They have a couple of really nice brotherly moments like that throughout the game, but for the most part, this is the best one. Interestingly, Professor Magnolia plays very little in this game compared to previous professors. Once you run down to her house in Wedgehurst and she gives you a bit of the rundown on the Pokedex and tells you about Dynamaxing, gives you Dynamax Band, she fucks off to her retirement home for the most part. Now, that's not to say that there's no Pokemon professor in this one. Her granddaughter, Sonia, basically takes up that role unofficially and then does all the lore dumps that the professor normally would throughout the game. You and Hop also briefly bump into a spooky dog in Spooky Forest. Bit of a nothing moment, but yeah, obviously it's the title legendary, yada yada yada. Narratively, I think the introduction works as a good base to build a solid narrative on, but it is so handholdy. Anyway, tutorial over, you and Hop get on a train to Motorstoke, only to be stopped by a crowd of Wooloo on the rails, so you've got to walk the rest of the way. And this is your first interaction with the infamous wild area. Now, this stretch here between where the train stops and where Motorstoke City is pretty short. From where you enter the wild area, you can see Motorstoke City. You won't spend very long there, and through most of the game, the wild area doesn't play that much of a role. It acts as the connective tissue between the more traditional linear routes, but in terms of narrative events, basically nothing happens in the wild area. Once reaching Motorstoke, you are introduced to your other rivals. Bidet, I don't know how to pronounce it, but I'm going to call him Bidet because I think it's funny, who is a little private school pretentious prick that is endorsed by Chairman Rose, who is the host of the Championship Cup, Gym Challenge, whatever the fuck they call it. Bidet might be one of the few characters that I actually like in S.H.I.E.L.D. because he has a personality that is more than one note. He does get a pretty full arc by the end of the story, and also he's actually a decent challenge most of the time. It's a nice change from the very friendly, spineless rivals that we've had in the past. I think it's a really good move. You're also introduced to Marnie, who is followed around by her fan club, Team Yell. I think Marnie is really charming, and her unsolicited fan club is endearing in a weird way. However, they seem to, narratively, take the place of Team Rocket, Team Galactic, Team Aqua, the normal evil team. So with that in mind, I have to compare them as such, and on that front they suck. They don't really contribute anything to the plot, except for one occasion that we'll get to later, and they never really force the player to do anything, to solve any problems. If you remember Team Aqua trying to flood the entire world in Hoenn, or Team Rocket and the Slowpoke well, that's one of my favorite memories from playing through Soul Silver for the first time, with all the Slowpoke tails and stuff. It's like really fucked up dark for a kid's game, but like, it made Team Rocket an actual threat. It made them interesting. Team Yell doesn't do that. They're on the path like any other trainer, and that's kind of it. Occasionally, they'll come up and challenge you like a rival, but then you just fight Marnie after that, who is actually a rival. It's just like, okay, make me do like 3 fights for no particular reason. Quick side note, but Team Yell and Marnie have not only some of the best music in Sword and Shield, but in my opinion, in the entire Pokemon franchise. Just wanted to mention that. There's a lot of really fucking good music in Sword and Shield. Anyway, you get very British, you have a pub brawl with Team Yell, and then you go over to the opening ceremony for the Champions Cup gym challenge thing, whatever. You know what I mean. The grandiose cutscene feels so strange because you've got the whole atmosphere, you've got the crowd chanting, you've got the music thumping, and then Chairman Rose starts speaking and no words come out. There's just text on the screen. Not even your little Animal Crossing. It's something that bothered me as soon as I saw the opening cutscene for the game, and it persists to be really jarring throughout the entire Sword and Shield experience. The opening ceremony is kind of nothing, and you head over to Turfield to fight Milo. Big old softy. An issue I have with the gym leaders as a whole is they're all pretty one note. They have typical professional attitude and then like one other character trait. So like Milo's really friendly. Nessa is kind of hardcore. The lady in the snow place is a MILF. Like that's their character traits. You also don't really interact with them outside of their gyms like in past games, where you usually have something happen in their town relating to the evil team, normally, like the Slowpoke well, and then you team up with the gym leader to go beat the crap out of the evil team, and then they're like, hey, you're cool, come see me at the gym. It's a bit of a like character moment where you get to know them a little bit, and then you also earn their respect a little bit before you just go and kick their ass as like some random kid. Anyway, you do the sheep herding challenge, you fight Milo, easy peasy, you're out of there. So you head over to Hillbury, you fight Nessa, who is the wettest gym leader in the franchise. Nope. And then you finally get introduced to Chairman Rose properly. You get to sit down and have a bit of a dinner with him. And they just paint him as the villain straight away. They make it really obvious. Sorry for spoilers, plot twist. He starts talking about how he wants to power Galar with infinite resources, just so, you know, like gets rid of all the world's problems. But they do it in this like such stereotypical, I'm doing the thing for the greater good, you just can't see it like I see it. But again, it's Pokemon, I'm not expecting narrative genius. He does tell you a little bit about Bidet and how he adopted him and gave him his first Pokemon, and that's actually a really nice character moment that I like, but it plays far more into Bidet's character than the chairman. Anyway, you now loop back to Motostoke to fight the fire gym. This one was actually kind of fun. I like where you have to like go into the gym and it's you and one other trainer versus a wild Pokemon, and you're kind of like all against each other. It's an interesting, fun one. You also might have noticed that at this point, we're at the third gym, and not a lot has happened other than the gyms. And that is one of my biggest concerns with Sword and Shield, is that there's very little story outside of doing the gym challenge. That's basically the entire narrative. In past games, like I mentioned, there's usually some sort of conflict to resolve. Someone's gone missing, you've got to find the gym leader because he's gone off to fight Team Rocket in the Slowpoke well, or there's something going on at Lake of Rage, or, you know, various other things. Sorry, Soul Silver is my favorite game. That's what I'm going to be referring back to the most. Sword and Shield have none of that. You can, for the most part, just walk straight into the gyms. Sword and Shield really push you straight from gym to gym without hesitation, which is even more noticeable with how linear the routes are. A lot of fans have complained since the move to 3D that GameFreak has taken out a lot of the weaving paths, the mazes that we used to have to travel through to get anywhere. Sword and Shield is by far the worst offender of any Pokemon game in this sense, but we'll get to that later. Something I've glazed over so far is how many times you fight Hop. In the first 2 hours, you fight him 4 times. 4. You continue to go up against him very frequently. He's kind of spineless, like I mentioned, not just in the, oh, he's very friendly way, he's also not a challenge. Also, all his little quips about, that was a super effective attack, how did you know to do that? And shit like that makes every fight with him feel 10 times longer. It gets really, really grating, and it's one of the reasons that me and a lot of people find Hop annoying as fuck. All this frustration about Hop also makes it more difficult to appreciate the good things about his arc, like the brotherly interaction with Leon and all the bits we'll get to later. So anyway, we beat the Motostoke gym leader and we head off to Hammerlock, and we don't fight Hop. Bidet turns up and says that he shat all over him, and I was like, yeah, no, that sounds about right. I'm glad I'm not the only one smacking down on that spineless bitch. As I mentioned before, Bidet's battles are usually a decent challenge. Not super difficult, it is still Pokemon, it is not not super challenging for anyone with more than 5 brain cells, which is only me on some days, but for the most part, pretty good. He mentioned something about collecting wishing stars to help Chairman Rose power Galar and all that. They don't really say that much. It's just like, hey, I'm gonna do some things, and then you fight. He directs you and Sonia, who just turns up, to the vaults of Hammerlock, because he was like, yeah, there might be some information in there that you want to check out. So in the vault, there's some stuff about 2 heroes that take up a sword and a shield to stop the darkest day, which is basically just Judgment Day, the apocalypse, whatever generic end of the world thing you want to put in there. So you jump out of the vault and you head over to Stow-on-Side for the next gym, which is home to either an emo or karate kid, depending on which game you're playing. Upon arrival, you find Bidet's already there and about to destroy an iconic ancient mural in order to find more wishing stars for Chairman Rose. So he just smashes the mural and it crumbles to reveal 2 ancient fursonas, I guess. Chairman Rose turns up and berates Bidet for destroying a national monument, obviously, and then basically revokes his sponsorship, which kicks him out of the gym challenge. Bidet throws a little private boy school tantrum and then scatters away. As much as you're like, okay, what an entitled prick, this is what I was saying about Bidet being a decently well-written character in this. He has a pretty full arc. So this little side moment of story with Bidet and the chairman is nice. It's nice to have something finally happen other than just, woo, we beat the gym leader. But the whole moment lasts about as long as I lost in bed. And much like Sleeping With Me, it's a very insubstantial moment. So you do the gym. I love bullying emos, so this was great for me. And then you move on to Bloonley. Bloonley? I don't know. Fairy Lady Opal is one of the more interesting gym leaders because she has a bit more personality than just, haha, crazy old lady. That's also kind of professional. She's not very professional, makes her very charming. But yeah, so she's a kooky old lady, obsessed with fairy types, hops on about respecting your elders as the ancient ones do. Typical lead-sniffing boomer shit. She's also obsessed with Pink and is looking for someone to replace her as fairy-type gym leader so she can fuck off to her retirement home. If you've been paying attention, you can probably figure out who is going to be the one to replace her, but we'll get to that. Unlike Professor Magnolia, the aged care staff can't quite restrain her, so she pops up in the story a little more later. After getting your badge and getting the fuck out of there, you see that she adopts Bidet as her successor. Really didn't see that one coming. This sets him on a new path, and once again, is one of the few characters that actually has an arc, that actually has development. You meet up with Sonia in Chichester, and you have a bit of a chat about lore. She gives a bit of an info dump as to what she's been researching off camera. You don't get to go on any of her research adventures or anything, but you'll get all the lore dumped on you. It's all very obvious exposition. GameFreak writes Pokemon games like they're designed for lobotomized monkeys with COVID. After beating the Chichester gym, which is either MILF or DILF flavored, depending on which game you're playing, you move on to Spikemouth, which is Marnie's hometown. When you arrive, the city is entirely locked down. Team Yell figures that if no one can come in and challenge their gym leader, no one can overthrow him. Fair enough. Marnie shows up outside of the city and offers the player a bargain, because Team Yell, much like real-life Twitter stans, don't actually represent their idol all that well. She says if you beat her in a battle, she'll show you the secret way into Spikemouth. It's a nice little character moment, which Marnie doesn't get that many of. It's nice that she sees you as an equal and not in a, yeah, you're my best friend way, just in a like, you're an equal competitor way. Once you get to the gym, you learn that Marnie's older brother, Pierce, is the gym leader. His little intro cutscene is very strange. When you enter the gym, you hear these punk riffs going. Honestly, goes pretty hard. And then Piers starts singing and no words come out of his mouth. It's just another example of the lack of voice acting, or even just the little Animal Crossing or the fucking Fire Emblem.
Well, I see.
This is really jarring. This gym's pretty small and Pierce doesn't allow Dynamaxing here. It sounds like someone's a little insecure about their size, but it also makes sense because if you Dynamaxed in this building, you'd probably cause the Spikemouth equivalent of 9/11. Anyway, Pierce is cool, but you beat him and you go off to Hamlock to fight the Dragon-type gym leader, Raihan. Raihan? I don't know. On the way there, you find out Magnolia's broken out of her old age home and Leon and Sonia are all there watching a strange red light over the city. Stone cold sober, so they're not tripping. Sonia says some stuff about the darkest day, blah blah blah, and then you just kind of go about your day. In previous Pokemon games, this is the sort of moment that would get you dragged off on a little side adventure, and you would go with Sonia to go investigate what the big red cloud is, or go to some temples or ancient ruins to see if some weird shit's going on. No, Sonia and Leon both tell the player to just go do the gym challenge and let the adults handle it, even though Sonia isn't an adult. This moment really exemplifies my biggest gripe with Sword and Shield, that the player has no agency. It's very much, don't worry about a story, just do the gyms. That's what you're here for, isn't it? You want to just have the Pokemon fight? Do the Pokemon fights. The fact that so much of the key narrative happens off screen is ridiculous. It baffles me. Why would you have so much of the story just not shown. Regardless, you don't get a choice, so you head off to Hammerlock to fight Raihan, while the adults do adult things that kids can't do. No, stop that, not like that. Get your mind out of the gutter. Raihan's another gym leader that I kind of liked. Bit of a crackhead. He's got crackhead energy. I'm pretty sure he's spending the gym budget on coke. The gym's publicly funded. Is that what my tax money is going towards? Good use of my tax money. After beating Raihan, you find out that Professor Magnolia has basically retired and given her coat to Sonia, which basically makes her the Pokemon professor, but like not officially, because then they make a big deal out of it in the post-game. So I guess she's still got some growing to do. I do like the pride that Sonia shows in earning that title, that position, but so much of her character development to get to that point happens off screen that to the player who's seen basically none of her arc, it feels shallow and unearned. Like she doesn't actually deserve it, like she hasn't actually worked for it. It's like that one coworker that gets a promotion, but you never really speak to them, you don't really know what their job is, and you're just like, cool, good for you, dude. Now you head north to Winden, which is the capital of Galar, and this is where the Champions Cup begins, which is basically a combination of Victory Road and the Elite Four. The first stage of the cup hits various challengers against each other, so it's you, Marnie, Hop, basically all the nobodies that are getting in on the fun. So after you beat basically everyone and become the finalists, Hop is like, oh, good for you, buddy, and Marnie tells Team Yell to support you because she's not in the competition anymore. Leon invites the player and Hop out to dinner to celebrate how far they've come from their little moment in Postwick. But then Leon never turns up for dinner. Kinda rude. Apparently the chairman sprung a surprise meeting on Leon. Sounds like someone's getting fired. Oleana, who we have met a couple of other times in the story, but she doesn't really do anything, so I haven't mentioned her, but she's Chairman Rose's secretary. She is very insistent that you and Hop don't interrupt the meeting, which in hindsight, yeah, no shit, don't let the kids into the meeting room. But this is where the actual evil team is revealed. Team Macrocosmos. I like the idea that the gym challenge is orchestrated by the evil team, but we're about 2 hours from the end of the story, and only now is the actual evil team introduced. That doesn't feel like a plot twist, it feels like an afterthought. After smacking the nuts of a bunch of goons, you get the key, you go up the tower, and you try to stop Chairman Rose from firing Leon, probably for the blatant nepotism of sponsoring Hop, who is very clearly incompetent. That sounds like nepotism to me. However, they're actually talking about delaying the championship match, which is far less interesting. Rose believes that he should trigger the Darkest Day early, which would then provide infinite power for Galar. And Leon's like, no, you don't know if the Darkest Day is actually a real thing. It sounds like you're just fucking up the environment. He also says that the championship match is way important, but that's because obviously his ego is massive and wants to be on TV. Anyway, everyone agrees to disagree and we all go home wondering if Leon's gonna get fired tomorrow. So in previous games, the Elite Four were a gauntlet of basically the toughest trainers out there. And shouldn't it be the Elite Five? Because usually you've got 4 Elite Four members and then the champion. I feel like that's misleading advertising, like they're like, oh yeah, people will prepare for 4, and then when they're exhausted right at the end, they're like, oh, I've just beat the 4th of the Elite Four, I'm good to go. They're like, nah bitch, you got a champion to go through. In Sword and Shield, it's a little different. It acts like a traditional tournament cup where you go against all the other gym leaders and then Leon. This gives everyone a chance to overthrow the current champion, and I think it fits way better in the Galar context than the traditional Elite Four would. And this is one of the bits of world building that I really like about this region. It's just one of few bits that I like about this region. And that also just basically makes Leon David Beckham. As you walk out onto the field, Bidet streaks out, balls hanging low, and says that if you beat him this time, he'll stop being a trainer forever. Very dramatic. A strong character moment, because once you kick his ass, because of course you do, he is still cheered on by everyone else in the stadium. And in this moment, he realizes that being the champion isn't necessarily what he wants. He doesn't want to be the best, and that accepting his position as the fairy-type gym leader might actually be a better path for him. That's what I was saying about Bidet having a pretty full arc. I really like his development, and I wish that every character in Sword and Shield got that sort of thought put into them. However, as with many things with Sword and Shield, I wish more of Bidet's arc happened on screen, because a lot of it does happen off screen. There's just like so much of Sword and Shield where nothing is happening, and it would be so much better if you had some interaction with those people that you were meant to feel intensely about. Anyway, you fight your way through a bunch of gym leaders and then challenge Big Boy Leon to take him down for his blatant nepotism. However, just before your match against Leon begins, Chairman Rose hacks into the screen and is like, "Yo bitches, it's Doomsday. My bad." So Leon yeets off to Hammerlock, dodging his Judgment Day once again, and figuring out whatever the hell is going on with Chairman Rose. And the player and Hop go to the Slumbering Weld, where you first saw that strange dog. You don't really find anything other than a tree stump that has a sword and shield on it. You say, fuck it, I guess we can stab the chairman with it and hope he doesn't have his tetanus shot. And then you run off to Hammerlock to help Leon. Chairman Rose has been feeding this big egg thing a bunch of wishing stars to use it as basically an infinite power source. And surprise, surprise, he can't control it. What do you know? Big spiky Digimon demon thing is tearing the universe a new one, apparently. You get on the roof and you see Eternatus and Leon are already facing off, with Leon being like, "No, you've got to catch him, it's the only way." Hop thinks back to all the things Sonya said to him off screen, because of course it was off screen, and then raises the sword and shield against Eternatus, which then summons Zacian and Zamazenta. With the help of the two first Sonas, you take on Eternatus and either capture or kill it, and then they just leave. If you've seen early versions of this battle, it seems to have been patched, but this game reeks of quality. So after yet another night's rest, you get to face off against Leon and take the championship place for yourself. This is where the main story ends. Thank fuck. The end. But not really, because the post-credit story is actually important, and it wraps up some of the arcs that I was complaining about. But I do think it is important to voice my issues with the main story before we move on to the post-game story and how that kind of changes things. Before I start on that, I want to talk about today's sponsor, Raid Shadow Legends. No, I'm kidding. The post-game doesn't really fix most of my issues with the main story, and with the main story being about 25 hours, it's similar to X and Y and Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire in length, but I feel like it was significantly less substantial. I feel like significantly less happened in that time. So by far, my biggest issue with the story is the pacing. It starts off incredibly slow with a lot of hand-holding, and then all of a sudden you've been blasted through 4 gyms without blinking an eye. Up until what most people would consider halfway through the game, 4 out of 8 gyms, that's halfway. There's not a lot of story happening other than Dynamaxing is a thing, and the gyms are a major sporting event here. Now after that 4th gym, it does slow down a little bit and starts dropping more story into the game, but not a whole lot. And almost all of it is just dumped on you by Sonya or Leon or Bidet. The last 2-ish, maybe 3 hours of the main story are where the game is definitely the most interesting. There is the most story happening here. But it's all crammed into the last 2 or 3 hours. Now, as much as the content of the story is also lacking, I don't have that much of an issue with it. It's basic as many Pokemon games are, though I would say it is one of the most basic, up there with X and Y being really, really simple. But X and Y had a lot more good characterization for the characters, even though the main plot was pretty boring. You still got a lot of those side adventures where you had to do some exploring and some investigating to figure out what was going on. Versus with Sword and Shield, every other character in the game is doing that for you and just giving you the information. That's way less interesting. And that's where we come back to my point about player agency. Because you aren't really doing much other than, yay, gyms. Nothing happens. It gets boring. You don't get to feel like you are that Pokemon trainer that is kind of saving the region, doing the right thing, being the big hero. You're just a kid playing footy. It's bland as balls. There are realistically so few story beats throughout Sword and Shield that GameFreak should have made it non-linear. With the wild area being the connective tissue between all the different areas of Galar, you should have just been able to go to the gyms in any order. and the story just kind of happened because there's so little story, you could read it in any order. Hell, even some of the more traditional linear games like Soul Silver are more non-linear than this. In Galar, you can straight up not go to the wrong gym. It's not a possibility. In Soul Silver, I had an instance where I ended up at the wrong gym. I got sidetracked, I did some exploring, and then I skipped 3 gyms accidentally and didn't understand why I was underleveled because I was 12. If you want to go hear the rest of that story, hop over and check out my podcast, Essential Experience. The last episode, we were chatting about Pokemon and some of our favorite Pokemon memories and what we want to see out of future games in the franchise. Shameless plug. Many of the characters are even more annoying than a YouTuber blatantly self-promoting in the middle of a video. About 2 hours in, I was ready to sacrifice a goat and at least 3 virgins to make sure I never saw Hop's stupid, super effective face again. Both Hop and Leon, as much as I like their brotherly dynamic, are both very one note. Hop gets a lot of character development on screen once we talk about the post-game, and that's one thing that makes his arc somewhat fulfilling, and I think it would be way more fulfilling if he wasn't so annoying. His whole development of basically kind of the same as Bidet, now that I think about it. This isn't in the script, this is me realizing the connection now. They both start off wanting one thing, and then life goes on and on and on and on, and they realize that, hey, actually I'm really good at this other thing. Maybe I should do that instead. Leon is a little less monotonous than Hop in this characterization, but it's still very much just, I want my brother to be the best he can. Generally, I was pretty happy to see both of them walk off screen whenever they were around. Marnie and Bidet are 2 of the characters that I actually liked, mostly because A, their battles were at least a semi-decent challenge, and for Bidet, I really thought he was an interesting character in that he was so fiercely devoted to his adoptive father, and then that whole arc changing when he was basically abandoned for committing arson. And Marnie was just genuinely charming. She talks to you like you were a person, not like you were a character. I kind of like Team Yell. I like that they're groupies, basically, and that I'm fighting idol stands throughout the game, but it did disappoint me that Team Macrocosmo was revealed right at the end of the game with like no foreshadowing at all. Anyway, once the credits roll, you and Hop go back to Postwick for a little bit, and you're all just having a nice little lunch. And then these 2 bozos show up, they yoink the sword and shield, and say that their haircuts make them descendants of Galarian kings? Okay, back to the asylum for you. So they start making Pokemon just Dynamax randomly throughout the world, and they start warring people, so you've got to stop that. And then once you've stopped a bunch of Dynamax Pokemon across the world, you go into Slumbering World and you see they've got one of the furry gods pretty tilted. You stop them, you adopt your Fursona, and then you and Hop have one last battle. I really like this. Hop actually has a spine. He's actually kind of tough here, and it wraps up his arc really well, with nice little bits of dialogue that make Hop an actual character instead of just a caricature. Hop accepts he's not going to be the champion and decides that being Sonya's new assistant is a pretty great position to have, and he finds his new place in the world, and life goes on and on and on and on. Then the player goes off to do DLC stuff. I don't know, I didn't buy the DLC. I didn't enjoy the base game enough to justify spending more money on Sword and Shield. I know a lot of Pokemon games are designed for younger audiences. They're very handholdy, they're very direct, but my god, is this the worst offender by far. Does GameFreak really think that between 2010, when Black and White came out, I think that was 2010, 2011, and now, kids have just gotten stupider? Oh, Masuda actually does. I'm just gonna read this quote from Masuda real quick, and it explains a lot about how Sword and Shield were designed. So when we tried to think about how kids these days generally play games, what came to mind was mobile games, really. Games which you play for a short time, and perhaps you'll be moving between various games pretty quickly. So if it was a game that kind of takes 2 hours to get into, we thought perhaps people would get a bit bored, and then decide to move on to a different game. And in this age, with so many games to choose from, we thought we'd rather make something that was easier to progress through and kind of tailor that playstyle to how we think the playstyle has evolved over the years and how children are playing games now. Basically, he's saying that no one has enough of an attention span to play a game for more than 2 hours. That would explain why you have several characters interacting with you every step you take, making sure that you're on the right path. Yes, you're doing it right, kiddo. Keep it up, you dumb little fuck. That's what GameFreak's saying to you. This quote from Masuda explains a lot of the design choices that went into Sword and Shield. The really simple routes that don't have a lot of exploring, the very short distances between towns, the fact that the game really speedruns you through the gyms, and that most of the story is crammed in at the end. It's because they don't expect people to get that far into the game. I know a good chunk of my friends that didn't finish Sword and Shield, not for the reasons that GameFreak think, because they were bored. You made the game to cater to people with a short attention span, and yet you managed to bore people. I think that really underestimates how smart kids can be. If one of my friends was playing Pokemon when he was 4 and managed to finish Ruby, is that not smart enough? Ruby is definitely a far more complex game than Sword and Shield is. Sure, he didn't know about IVs or necessarily what all the abilities did, or even what all the moves did, but he could enjoy the damn game. This mentality is what is wrong with GameFreak. They think people have decayed in their attention span so much that they can't enjoy a game. A lot of you are probably arguing that Pokemon is aimed at younger audiences, and so the story is less important. My counter argument, Pokemon Black and White, that is still definitely targeted at the same audience that every other Pokemon game is targeted at. And yet it is evidence that Game Freak can create a compelling story that weaves in the questions of the ethics around the Pokemon trainer dynamic and how one should reevaluate their moral compass and how to acknowledge when you've been manipulated into being the bad guy. It's also an example of how Game Freak had, I don't think has in the current context, but had the balls to make pretty big decisions with Pokemon. The fact that while playing through Black and White, you are restricted to only the Unova Pokemon is a great design choice. It makes that region feel massively more unique than everywhere else, and you still get all your Pokemon at the end of the game. You just gotta get to the end of the game and then you can bring your Pikachu over if you really want. That sort of design forces returning players out of their comfort zone and makes the experience more unique for new players. And, like I said, you still get a full Pokedex at the end of Black and White. You just gotta wait until the end. And since we're comparing Pokedexes, Dexit. So the controversy that split the Pokemon fanbase. While Black and White still gave you the option to bring in your entire critter collection, that is not an option in Galar. There are only 400 Pokemon in the base Pokedex, and the DLC adds some more, but I haven't got the DLC. With the DLC included, there's about 25% of all Pokemon unavailable in Sword and Shield. Doesn't matter if you've got it sitting in Pokemon Home from a previous game, you just can't bring it in. For obvious reasons, a lot of the fanbase are concerned that their favorite Pokemon is just gonna get stuck in Pokemon Home for an indeterminate amount of time. That ain't fun. Given that leaks say that Pokemon Legends Arceus only has 243 Pokemon, I think it's fair to assume that the Pokemon fanbase is never getting a full Pokedex back. During the Nintendo Treehouse event in E3 2019, the one that we mentioned earlier where Sword and Shield was revealed, director Omori and Masuda both brought up some reasons as to why they nuked the Pokedex. There were concerns about battle balance and preserving quality and picking the best Pokemon for the region, which makes enough sense at a surface level. But battle balance was never a concern until now, and while wanting to preserve quality makes sense, many Pokemon fans feel that quality is not exactly the right way to describe Sword and Shield. As for picking the best Pokemon to fit the region, Black and White did that better without excluding an entire Pokedex, and making it much more distinguished by making it strictly Unova Pokemon that you could catch in Black and White. A better experience overall. The quality argument really got under my skin after they mentioned the Switch enabling more expressive animations. And then they proceeded to show us the same animations we've had on the 3DS since 2013. They also clearly exported the 3DS models and just shipped them over to Sword and Shield, but that's not a bad thing, mind you. Creatures Inc. made incredibly high poly models when they moved over to 3D on the 3DS, and That's why the 3DS games kinda run like ass, especially in double battles. It's because the models are too high polygon for the 3DS to handle all at once, and that's why the frame rate dropped. However, using 6-year-old 3DS animations, not quality. In fact, this got me so tilted that I wrote up basically an essay as to why that wasn't the right approach and what GameFreak could have done. A possible strategy to solve exactly that issue that they were trying to avoid by preserving quality, by cutting the Pokedex. Yeah. Masuda and Amori also said that a team any larger than the 200-ish employees at GameFreak would make it more difficult to make sure that everyone's on the same page. That's a direct quote. And to me, and many others on the internet, that just sounds like bad management. So all up, the official reasons for Dexit didn't have a lot of people convinced. There's a pretty extensive collection of people talking about possible solutions and why they're unhappy about the whole Dexit situation. I'm not the only one. Leading up to launch, and also when I was playing it, it was seeming like Sword and Shield was going to be a 3DS game ported over to the Switch, which, if leaks are to be believed, is actually exactly what happened. That also explains why the models for many of the Pokemon are polygon for polygon identical. As someone that has a background in 3D CG and animation, I wrote up a little article just being like, hey, Game Freak, this is what you could do better to do all the animations better, but also like cut down on the workload, because that's a lot of animations. Ignoring the other issues that much of the community has with the upcoming Pokemon games, my most notable grievance is the awful animations. Masuda himself said that part of the reason they limited the Galar Pokedex was so they could use the Switch's power to give Pokemon more expressive animations. I think this is a perfectly valid reason to limit the Pokedex, but from what we've seen in pre-release gameplay, the animations are lackluster at best. Some people have proposed some ideas and shown off their own animations. I hate to complain without providing an alternative solution, so I started thinking up a way to overcome the task of animating 800 plus characters. The solution: given that there are a wide range of shapes and sizes across the 800 Pokemon in the franchise, rigging and animating all of them individually would be a gargantuan task. To make this process simpler, we're going to group Pokemon by how similar their skeletons are. Bulbapedia already has categories for body types, but I found there was a lot of variation within the categories, so I went and did my own. For the sake of this exercise, I'm only going to use Gen 5 Pokemon, mostly because it has the most Pokemon for a single region, but also because I don't hate myself and don't want to do all 809. I went and downloaded images of all the Nova Pokemon and their forms and sorted them into the following categories: unique, bipedal humanoid, bipedal without arms, tripedal, quadruped, large, quadruped small, floating object, floating arms, bipedal dinosaur/dragon, flying dinosaur/dragon, fish, bird, bug, snake, and rodent. For unique, all starter, legendary, and mythical Pokemon are in this category, and are generally considered the most important Pokemon of any generation. All these Pokemon get unique skeletons and therefore unique animations. Other Pokemon that also don't fit into a category can fall under unique. Most of the categories are pretty self-explanatory. If doing the entire Pokedex, you would definitely need more than just these categories, but for Unova and for the sake of the exercise, I think this does a good enough job. Now obviously not every Pokemon in every category has the same skeleton exactly, so how does this make the rigging and animation workflow any easier? To begin with, we're assuming that in the move over to the Switch, Game Freak, Creatures Inc., whoever has magically lost all the rigs for the Pokemon models, and have to create all the skeletons from scratch. As an example, you would rig the skeleton for Arceus, and then copy it over to Woobat or Braviary with some small adjustments. Similarly, you would do the idle flying animation on Arceus, and then reuse that animation for other Pokemon with the same base skeleton. So based on the math we did earlier, at 809 Pokemon with 15 move animations, there would have to be 809 unique skeletons with 12,135 animations. As mentioned earlier, a lot of moves currently share their animation with other moves, so with this new system of 14 categories, excluding unique, we would have 809 variations of 14 skeletons, with 15 animations for each skeleton. About 210 animations. Now there are problems with the solution. It wouldn't be this simple in practice. There are many problems to applying this workflow with an entire studio. Ultimately, no solution to this problem is perfect. Here are the major flaws I've come across so far. About 22% of the Nova Pokemon ended up in the unique category, and extrapolating this to the entire Pokedex would mean about 180 Pokemon would receive unique skeletons and animations. This could be reduced by adding more granular categories. I don't think 14 is enough for the entire Pokedex. Copying and pasting a skeleton isn't also as simple as I make it out to be. The artist would also need to do weight painting, which is basically gluing the 3D model to the bones of the skeleton, and making sure that the animation doesn't do any weird clipping. Animating all Pokemon like this means that the unique character of each Pokemon won't really be shown off much. This could be solved by giving each Pokemon a unique idle and walk animation, while still copying the battle animations. Despite these flaws, I think the concept is fairly sound for a gargantuan task of animating nearly 1,000 models once Sword and Shield release. So the point I'm trying to make, aside from the fact that GameFreak could have done better, is that even older titles like Pokemon Battle Revolution on the Wii had better animations than what was delivered in Sword and Shield with preserving quality. That game even has a similar amount of Pokemon, 493 over Sword and Shield's 400, although there is less of an overworld to worry about, so the balance is a little different. Genuinely, I think that Battle Revolution looks better than Sword and Shield does at any point. And, oh, what's that? It wasn't developed by GameFreak? Fancy that. What other Pokemon game looks better than Sword and Shield? Pokemon Coliseum on the GameCube, a full-fat Pokemon RPG game on a home console 14 years before the Switch. Sure, it doesn't look the best, but it is showing us that, most certainly, it isn't the hardware that's holding us back from having very expressive Pokemon animations. It's GameFreak. While Dexit was a much more clear-cut controversy, there are some other changes in Sword and Shield that weren't quite as divisive as you would think. GameFreak's choice to drop Mega Evolutions, a very popular mechanic introduced in X and Y and used throughout the 3DS games, for Dynamaxing is a very interesting choice. Giving every Pokemon the ability to be the star of the show for a battle is an interesting choice. That really fixes one of the big critiques levied against Mega Evolutions, that was, you really built your team around your Mega of choice. And so when you're going up against someone online, you could look at their team and you could probably figure out which one was their Mega Evolution. By letting any Pokemon Dynamax, which is really just a big boy with more health, it really evens out the playing field and can lead to some interesting mix-ups. That being said, there are some Mega Evolution designs that I'm really sad to see go. In particular, Mega Slowbro, one of the funniest, and Mega Sableye, probably my favorite. But ultimately, those Pokemon leaving us isn't the end of the world. And then, GameFreak undoes all the benefits of Dynamaxing by adding Gigantamaxing, which is just Mega Evolution, but worse? So we got rid of the really good Mega Evolution designs for Meowth on a torture rack, extra thick and clappable Lapras, cake Pokemon that's caked the fuck up, a literal fucking skyscraper. I would be lying if I said that some of these designs didn't get a laugh out of me. In fact, most of them do. But they're nothing compared to the Mega Evolution designs that were so much more impactful. The G-Max moves that Gigantamax Pokemon get are also equally uninteresting. They're meant to be bombastic, big moments. And they're just as stiff and lifeless as the rest of the game's animations. And now, the wild area. Possibly the best and worst part of Sword and Shield. The wild area is a collection of varied environments. Somehow in the middle of the UK, you have like 6 different kinds of forest and a desert, but it's cool. There's different Pokemon in each area, and there's dynamic weather as well, so when you're in a certain area on a certain day with certain conditions, there's a different selection of Pokemon. It's interesting, it keeps it fun and mixed up, and it brings you back every day. It's also a great change for a franchise that's been stuck in linear, fixed camera environments for far too long. The trailers really made it seem like the wild area was the core of the game. In a very literal, physical sense, it is. It is the connective tissue between all the different regions of Galar. But it's not actually that big. It's hardly integral to the narrative. In fact, barely related to the narrative at all. No narrative beats happen in the wild area, except for the fact that you need to go through the wild area to get to some routes. You could spend almost none of the game there. Like, if you had replaced the wild area with just your normal linear routes connecting areas together, the main story of Sword and Shield would be no different. It's looking like Legends Arceus is kind of going to be a wild area too, which I'm not super happy about, but we'll talk about that later. There are actually some really great views throughout the wild area, but the quality, the execution, the heavy level of detail culling makes these areas feel really barren. Pokemon, berry trees, and other trainers pop in pretty close to you. This pop-in makes the wild area feel really barren when you try to get those nice wide scenic screenshots. The whole dynamic weather thing as well sounded great until you've got a snowstorm on one side and you step over the boundary and it is suddenly clear as day. It's very jarring, and it's one of the things that adds to the lack of polish on Sword and Shield. So, as I mentioned before, the wild area during the story acts as the connective tissue between different bits of the region, and that's fine, but it leads you back onto a lot of routes that are very linear, like we have had since X and Y, where the world is very limited in how much exploration you can do. There's nothing like Mount Moon, or any of the massive caves that you used to have to explore and use Flash to get through. Exploring's boring. There's nothing to explore. Genuinely, the routes are so simple, I would describe them as brain dead. Even more brain dead than a lot of the routes in X and Y. I genuinely got excited about the first cave that I was going into, and while it was pretty, it was more or less a straight line from the entrance to the exit. And most of the routes are exactly this, a straight line from A to B with the tiniest bit of variation. While these areas are massively linear, some of my favorites are gorgeous. The glowing fungus forest in Balloonly, mwah, masterpiece, and the spooky atmosphere of the slumbering world, both great, but those environments are few and far between. There's really not a lot of great scenery in Sword and Shield. The towns are also massively boring. There's very little to do other than appreciate the different aesthetics. There is very rarely anything there except your regular Poke Center and the gym, and then maybe one or two fashion options if you're into that. I don't particularly care for it, so I didn't really bother. There's also very rarely any events, like I mentioned, that take you off of the path that you're expecting to go on. Very rarely is there anything like the Slowpoke Well, or going into Team Rocket's base. There's none of that. There's a couple of exceptions to that. There's the Battle Tower in Wyndon, which I have spent a lot of time in. Do love Battle Tower, and God bless Toby Fox. That's all I'm going to say about that. And the Hotel Ionia in Chichester, I think. Other than that, there's really not a lot worth exploring. Overall, I think that Sword and Shield really lacks the character that a lot of previous Pokemon games have had, despite visually presenting better. So there's still a lot of other stuff I want to talk about with Sword and Shield, but they're all pretty small. So I've got a list here, and I'm just gonna kind of ramble through these ones. Music slaps, as always. Pokemon music is pretty much always great, especially, like I mentioned, the Toby Fox track in the Battle Tower. God tier, genuinely the best song in the game. Go listen to it right now, or it's playing in the background. It might be playing in the background. The core gameplay loop's good. It's Pokemon. Like, when you get to the end of the game and you're just battling either in the Battle Tower or online, that's still great. I got no complaints about that. Speaking of battling trainers and building teams, Sword and Shield absolutely has the best competitive tools in terms of XP candies and all your Pokemon training utilities and buying items and stuff. It's the most accessible of any game, and that's made playing online against friends, against randoms, or in the battle tower, all of that is really fun in Sword and Shield because it's so much easier to get into. You spend so much less time just building your team, and you get more time to fuck around with it and see if it works or not. Sometimes there are like weird pauses in battles where like an animation will finish, and then it's like the game's thinking about what's happening next. It's really odd, and it adds to what is generally a pretty slow battle system. Even with the text at the highest speed, it still feels like turns take too long, and I think they could really be simplified. The new textures on the models look great. Like I mentioned before, the models are the same as what we have had on the 3DS since 2013, and that's not a bad thing. They're high poly models. But the textures are new, and the textures look crisp. What isn't so crisp, or rather what is too crisp, is a lot of the Pokemon's cries are still the Game Boy or DS cries. And that ain't great. That don't sound too good, especially when you have some Pokemon like Pikachu and Eevee doing a full Pika-P, and then you have Bidoof or God, whichever you choose, just blah, 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 blah. That pop-in that I mentioned when I was talking about the wild area is not exclusively a wild area problem. It happens in the linear areas as well. You have complete control over the camera, and you're telling me I'm still gonna have to see things pop in and out of my view when you could cull so much more efficiently because you have a fixed camera? What are you doing? Raid battles are fun if you have enough friends to make a full team. Playing with the CPUs means you're basically not gonna win any of the harder ones because your allies are just gonna be stupid as all hell and just do random stuff. Even if you're playing online and playing with randoms, it's not a great experience. Sometimes online is just like, no, there's no one available. Even though it's Pokemon, so there's definitely people available. It's just, yeah, it's not a great system. That being said, Nintendo online systems as a whole, not great, so I'm not entirely pinning this on GameFreak. It's just like kind of a general Nintendo issue. Much like Pokemon and Me in X and Y, where you got to pet with your Pokemon and feed them food and stuff. Really cute. Camping in Galar is so much fun. It's really cute. They don't really have that many animations, but that's definitely where a lot of character comes into the game. It's a shame it's kinda boring. Like, once you've done it a couple of times, it's like, okay, it's, I guess that's the same 6 animations and the same 3 curries I'm gonna make. As much as I hate having forced XP share on, there aren't enough trainers in this game for your team to be leveled without it. Like, the game is balanced around having forced XP share on. So I can kind of understand where that design choice came from. Like, in previous games, once you had XP share on, grinding was pretty easy because the amount of trainers in the game were designed for without XP share. But then we moved towards like the 3DS games and we're getting fewer trainers. It's a bit lighter on that front, and so XP share is on to make it just a bit easier to balance your team. And now the game is designed around having the XP share on. If you didn't have the XP share on, you would have to spend so much time in wild battles grinding levels. And we all know that grinding wild battles isn't fun. That being said, in terms of experience, they give you access to XP candy way too early. I would personally leave it towards the end of the game if you're playing through, because you could be massively overleveled so quickly. They give you so many just from doing raid battles. The XP candy kind of busted in terms of the story, but like I mentioned before, it's a great tool for team building. So Sword and Shield left a lot to be desired, especially after the fanbase was generally not too happy with Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee. But I want to put down a hot take. Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee are some of the best games in the franchise. And I know that's a hot take, so let me explain. Those games were marketed very clearly as a introductory game for people that are new to Pokemon. It's a bit simplified, it's more aiming towards that Pokemon Go crowd, and they want to get them buying a Switch and then getting into Pokemon main. And it does exactly that. It is a simplified Pokemon game, and Pokemon's already a very simple game. So the fact that they simplified it without making it absolutely brain dead is impressive. I love it for that. Visually, it's so well polished. It looks so good. The animations still aren't great, but there is nothing like the ridiculous pop-in or the really hideous textures. Just all around, it is the cleanest looking Pokemon game by far. I don't love Let's Go. I don't love GameFreak's fetish for Gen 1 and Kanto, but it's a good game. So back to the future. What do I want to see from Game Freak in future Pokemon games? What's written in the script is actually slightly different to how I feel, because this morning, the last trailer for Pokemon Legends Arceus came out, and I'm less convinced by it now. Originally, I was feeling like, oh yeah, it's an expansion on the wild area. It's bringing in some nice gameplay ideas. The fact that like trainers are like dodging, it's a bit more interaction. My concerns about the battle system, about like things taking too long, animations having weird pauses and stuff, that seems to be a non-issue. But all my visual problems with Sword and Shield in terms of not just the art direction, but the technical execution, the very extreme LOD culling, making pop-in super obvious, massive texture tiling in the open world areas. It's really not looking that great. 243 Pokemon, not loving that, but it is kind of a spin-off game, so I think I can live with that. It kind of looks better than Sword and Shield, but not massively. Remember when fans were defending the E3 trailers for Sword and Shield, being like, oh yeah, there's still a few months, they'll polish it up, and then it didn't get polished up, and that was exactly what we got. Yeah, I feel like that's happening again with Arceus. The animation's also looking better, not good, better than Sword and Shield, but I'm gonna save most of my judgment for when I play it. Which, speaking of, I will be playing it this weekend when it launches over on my Twitch, which will be linked down below. And I think this is actually a good point to wrap things up, because I've been lying on the floor for 3 hours. All in all, I think my conclusion with Sword and Shield is that when it comes to literally the most profitable media franchise in the world, no product should ever come out as underbaked, as incomplete as Sword and Shield did. And while I'm not avoiding the hype train for Legends Arceus, I am being conservative because I don't trust Game Freak not to disappoint me again. Hey, welcome to the end of the video. It's going to be a long one. I've been lying on the floor for 3 hours, so I gotta edit this by like Friday. So anyway, thank you for watching. I really appreciate it. This is definitely the longest video I've done, so I hope that you enjoyed it. If this video does well, I'll do a long video on Legends Arceus as well. See how they've learnt from Sword and Shield and what game design choices are different and what are the same, because at the moment, a lot's looking the same. I mentioned my podcast earlier, Essential Experience, that's linked down below. That's the fun one where I chat with some content creator friends about their favorite games, what makes them great, what, from a game design angle or a story angle, whatever angle that they think makes it a great game. And that's been fun. That's a pretty new project for me. And there's an episode on Pokemon. If you want to go check the Pokemon one, that's episode 3. That's not... How do you normally do 3? I don't know. I feel like that. Otherwise, like I said, I'm going to be streaming Legends Arceus on launch weekend, so pop over to my Twitch and we stream mostly Minecraft, but we'll be streaming Pokemon a lot in the next few days. Anyway, thank you for watching, and I'm going to go pass out before I edit this. Good grief. Game Freak sucks.